In this video, I'm going to teach you how I take apart my entire bassoon piece by piece, key by key, rod by rod, in order to oil all of the keys. My name is Dr. Natalie Law, and I'm a professional bassoonist, and I love to help people learn how to play the bassoon and learn all sorts of things about the bassoon, just like in this video where I'm teaching you how to take out the keys. And if that's a topic of interest to you, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel, like the video if it's helpful, and comment any questions or thoughts you have down below. Now, this is an maintenance item that needs to be done somewhat frequently. I do it at least once a year, sometimes twice a year, depending on a number of factors. But it's something that needs to happen at least, once a year, once every other year, kind of depending on how much you're playing your bassoon. And the purpose of this maintenance item is to oil all the keys so that they're no longer noisy. When you click on the keys, that they're not going to be making all sorts of metal clacking, like metal on metal sounds, and it just makes the keys move smoother. And this is also a great opportunity when you've got keys off of your bassoon to actually go ahead and clean underneath where all the keys are, the parts of the bassoon that are hard to get underneath there when the keys are on. So those are kind of the two main objectives that I'm doing in this video. Now, that being said, I want to make a big disclaimer right up front that I do not recommend that you use this video as your only resource and go and take apart your entire bassoon. Please do not do that. I learned how to do this process from my teacher in grad school who knows what he's doing, and I've done this process now a number of years, and so I feel pretty comfortable and pretty confident doing it myself. If you've never done this before, I highly recommend that if you're interested in doing this, that you find a teacher locally to you who knows what they're doing and can walk you through this process, or find a bassoon repair expert who can walk you through this process and knows what they're doing. Because even though this whole process, as you're going to see in this video, it's not rocket science, as long as you're careful and go slow and really diligent about how you take apart your bassoon, put it back together, it's honestly not that difficult. However, there are so many little parts and pieces and unique little mechanisms on the bassoon that, it's easy to make a mistake. It's easy to bend something. It's easy to lose a screw. It's easy to get mixed up and forget how things go back together. Because as you'll see in this video, there's a certain order of things that you should do as you're taking apart your bassoon. And, if you mix that up, things could go really wrong. And if you don't have somebody, like a teacher or repair expert to go to, if that happens, it can be really stressful, speaking from experience. And, for me, I do this on my own, and I also have a repair expert that I trust who I can go to if I have a problem. So if something goes wrong on my bassoon, I can go to him, and it's not a big deal. And this actually happened this time that I took my bassoon apart. A rod, as I was taking it out, I must have taken it out at a slight angle and it bent just enough, or perhaps it was bent beforehand and I bent it enough that when it goes back in, that the rod wasn't operating the way that it was supposed to, and the key was kind of getting stuck. And so I had to go take that in and get that particular thing fixed. But that's the risk that I run, knowing that I have that resource nearby. So, even me who's done this for a number of years and feels pretty comfortable doing it, I still have to rely on somebody who knows much more about bassoon repair and maintenance than I do. And so I'll give a big shout out to Bruce McCall at Meridian Winds in Okemos, Michigan. He's my go-to guy, and he has fixed my bassoon on a number of occasions, saved my butt a number of times, and he's also been super kind to me and taught me so many things. I always love to watch him work on my bassoon because I learned so much. So he's my backup resource. This video skips over some parts and doesn't go into every last little detail that you might need to know as you're taking apart your bassoon, and it just really helps to learn this in person and from somebody who knows what they're doing. But the purpose of this video, I wanted to put this out there, is because it is something that I do really regularly, and you might be interested in what someone like me does really regularly with maintenance. And it's interesting to see the bassoon taken apart completely, what it looks like underneath the keys, what the process is like to take it apart and put it it back together. It's informational in the fact that, if you were in a bind and you needed to maybe take off one key on your bassoon because it was particularly loud, or you had some other problem, and in order to fix that issue, maybe a binding key, you needed to take off several keys to get to the thing that's the issue. You'll see throughout this video that that is the case. There's lots of keys sort of overlapping each other and are on top of each other, and so you have to take things off in a specific order to get to certain areas of the key work. And so my hope is that, if you have sort of emergency issue like that, maybe you can use this video and see how I took it apart, the process that I did, and do it yourself. Those are really the only reasons that I posted this video. I am not a repair expert. I am not the end-all be-all knowledge on bassoon maintenance. Some people do things differently than I do and may disagree with the way that I'm taking apart my bassoon, or disagree with the product that I'm using to oil my keys, or whatnot. So please don't take this as your only resource of information on taking apart your bassoon and oiling the keys. I just wanted it to be interesting and informative and helpful, if you were in some sort of bind and had to take, maybe one key off of your bassoon. So, I'm going to kind of walk you through how this goes. Now, this video is going to be longer because it takes a long time. It's an hours-long process. If you were to take apart your bassoon like I am, you would want to leave plenty of time to do so. You would want to, I would say, dedicate basically an entire day. Now, it's not going to take an entire day by itself, but you want to just set aside the time so that you're not feeling rushed or pushed to get it done, and you don't have like a deadline that you need to meet or anything like that. And I would also do this process on a day and a week where you aren't having to perform somewhere, or you don't have a bunch of rehearsals. Give yourself at least a couple days buffer so that if something does happen on the day that you are taking it apart, that you can take it to a repair shop, take it to a teacher, figure something out, get help. You have time to figure it out before you really need your bassoon. That is key, because if you're rushing, you're not going to be paying as much attention to what you're doing, and you're more likely to make mistakes. So let's talk about when exactly you should do this process if you are going to do it yourself. Like I mentioned before, I usually do this once a year, maybe twice a year, kind of depending on a number of factors. And again, the main purpose of this is to quiet down your bassoon and to make the keys move more smoothly. We're putting grease on the moving parts of the bassoon so that you don't hear that metal on metal sort of clacking sound. And I know that I have to start doing my annual maintenance when I start to hear certain keys get a little noisy. I'll start to hear my low D key on my long joint start to get noisy. I'll start to hear certain keys on my boot joint start to get noisy. I'll start to hear, again, more of that metal on metal sound. That means that, the grease has kind of worn away, and again, it's metal on metal clacking. And it depends on some other factors as well. It depends on where you live and the climate that you live in. For me, I live in Michigan in the United States, where there are 4 distinct seasons. It can get really hot and humid in the summer. It can get really cold and dry in the winter. And that temperature change and humidity change all affects your bassoon. I mean, the bassoon itself will expand and contract. The wood will expand and contract as the seasons change and as the weather changes. And, the metal parts don't expand and contract in the same way that the wood does. And so what ends up happening is, certain parts of the bassoon are expanding and contracting at different rates, and then things might start to bind a little bit, or they just need, or the grease that was previously put on them will start to sort of wear away throughout that use. I mean, and it's also just wear and tear on the instrument. As you press the keys down numerous times, that's putting wear and tear on them. And so they need, lubrication to be able to work properly. So I kind of base it on what I feel, but I tend to notice the noisiness coming when the weather changes. So usually for me, like October, November, when the weather starts to get a little cooler, the humidity starts to go down, that's a really good indication that my keys need to be oiled. And the other time of year is usually kind of like mid to late spring, April, May, as we're getting into summer season. That's when I start to notice a need for doing this process. So that's my gauge. And honestly, I wait until I start to hear something, but I mean, you can be more proactive than that if you are going to do this process, which again, I only recommend if you're going to do it under the guidance of someone who knows what they're doing. So let's talk about the materials and the tools that you need to take apart your bassoon. There really aren't that many things that you need to successfully take apart your bassoon. You need a pair of pliers and, just the pliers that you typically might use for reed making or reed adjusting will do perfectly fine. Now, if you have a regular pair of pliers, they often have jaws on them. And, if you're pressing hard on the soft metal of the keywork, that can, put indentations in the keywork. And a lot of times it's just kind of cosmetic damage. A lot of times that's not going to cause like structural damage to the keys or anything. But you can do what I did here, which is put tape over the jaws of your pliers in order to minimize sort of that grippage that's caused by, the little jaws. And really, if you're a repair person, you're not going to be using just regular pliers. There's, I believe, like parallel jaw pliers that have smooth jaws and are actually parallel to each other, whereas most pliers come in at kind of an angle and you can't get full leverage. So just know that this is not the best tool to use, but it's what I have, it's what I use, and I use the tape to sort of minimize any cosmetic damage that the jaws might cause. The other tools that you need are some screwdrivers, and for me on my bassoon, I basically need 2 screwdrivers. I need one for larger screws and one for the smaller screws. And that's where I have actually this kit of screwdriver heads that are removable on a handle. And I only end up using a couple of them throughout my bassoon, but they end up being handy for a number of uses. You can get these at most, hardware stores. And that's another note I'm going to make a note on is, what you're seeing on my bassoon is going to be different than what's on your bassoon. So the types of screws that you're seeing, the types of rods that you're seeing, the pins that you see me just sort of pull out of the posts, your bassoon may not even have some of those things. It may have a totally different, look to it. But most of the time, 9 times out of 10, it's just some sort of screw and you need some sort of screwdriver head. So it's about finding the right size and shape of the screwdriver head before you get started. And in addition to those kind of basic tools, you also need some sort of grease. I use this Park Tool high performance bicycle grease, and typically you find this at like bike shops, or you can order online. I'll drop it down in the description box. And this is what I was taught to use. It's one option. I've also heard from a bassoon repair specialist that white lithium grease is another option. So just know that this is also not the end-all be-all thing that you can put on your bassoon. It's just what I use. I know a number of people who do use it as well, and I've never had any issues with it, and I think it does a pretty good job of keeping my keys well lubricated throughout the year. So that's pretty much all I use in terms of grease or oil on the bassoon. You on a bassoon, you typically need to use something thicker than typical, oil that you might put on clarinets or flutes or whatever, because the keys are bigger and there's more sort of motion going on. I end up just putting a little bit on a paper towel, and then I just dip the parts into that as I go. And I find that's easier than trying to use the whole bottle just to put a little bit on a screw. I find that's kind of the easiest way, because you'll find if you do this that a lot of times you start off using too much and it just kind of ekes out the sides and you have a lot to clean up. So it's kind of an art to figure out exactly how much you need that's enough, but also not going to create a huge mess when you put the rods back together. And you'll also notice that I have some Q-tips and some pipe cleaners as well. I use those as I'm working throughout the bassoon to clean in areas that are hard to kind of get with the paper towel as I'm kind of cleaning up. I use the pipe cleaner to run through some of the posts, especially if I feel like they're really dirty. I'll use that to run through the little rollers on certain keys, just to clean out any residual grease or dust or whatever that might have settled. Those are just kind of helpful. Now, to talk about like the actual process I'm using for taking apart my bassoon. So I go piece by piece. I usually start with the bell, as you saw me start with in the beginning, because it's kind of the easiest one. And if you're doing this for the first time, I'd recommend starting with the bell for sure, because it's just one key. It's that low B flat pad for that joint. And so there's one thing you have to take off, and it's very clear how it goes back together. It's very simple. So it's kind of a nice warm up to the rest of the bassoon. And then as far as what order you go in for the rest of your joints, it doesn't really matter so much. I guess I went to the long joint and then the boot joint and then the wing joint, which I actually finished on a second day. So, but it doesn't really matter, but going joint by joint, definitely don't have two joints going at once, because if you mix up the screws or rods can be really hard to figure out what's going on. So one joint at a time. And as you're going, especially when you start on a joint other than the bell, you're going to figure out that there has to be sort of a process for taking apart the keys. So I usually just start with the keys or rods or whatever I'm taking off that are like the most easy to access right off the bat. Like I can easily unscrew right at the top. I don't need to take something else off, because what you need to do, and you'll notice throughout this video, is that you need to line up your keys in the order that you took them off, so that you can put them on in that reverse order when you go to put everything back together. And so I take off the thing that's most accessible. Sometimes there's a couple options you could start with, but I just kind of try to work in some sort of order or pattern that seems to make sense. There's not always, it doesn't have to be in an absolutely specific order. But then I just kind of work my way through and take off keys that need to be taken off. And then as I'm going throughout the joint, you'll notice that every time I take off a key, I'm always returning the screws or the rod or whatever was holding it in place. I'm returning those to the posts that it sits in. And that's extremely important, because even though a lot of these parts are identical to each other, some of them, especially like the rods, are different lengths, and they go in a certain orientation. So as soon as you take a key off, you want to put everything but the key back the way that it was, so that when you go to put the key back on, you know the orientation that the screws were in, you know exactly which posts were associated with that. There's no question, because it is really easy to get messed up. And also it's really easy to lose screws. So if you just screw them back in as soon as you've got the part off, that really mitigates that risk of losing something or getting things mixed up. And so you take everything off the joint, and you have it lined up in the order that you took it off in. You have all your screws and rods sitting where they were. And so once everything is off, then I usually, as you've seen, will wipe off kind of the areas underneath the keys. There's usually dust and dirt and, smudges or whatever, just from use, just from existing. And so I'll wipe those off as best I can, just with a dry paper towel. I don't use any sort of solution or anything, because usually that I don't really need anything. And then I will start putting on putting the keys back on in the reverse order. And so I'll start with the last key that I took off, and then I will put it back on where it goes, and I'll clean before I actually put it in place. I'll, if it was held in place by screws or if it was held in place by a rod, I'll take the part that was holding it together and I'll clean off the old grease. Usually it's black, the grease has turned black over time, and I'll clean that off. And then once every part that's associated with that key has been cleaned and wiped off, then I'll put grease on the screws or the rod, and then I will put the key back in place just the way it was. And then I go to the next key that I had, the next to last key that I had taken off, and do the same process. Any rods or screws that was holding it in place, I'll quickly wipe those off, put some grease on, and then put the key back in place. As you're putting the keys back in place, you'll notice that there are a lot of wires that sort of put tension on the key and keep it in a certain orientation. They might, there might be a wire or spring that's holding it in place, keeping a pad closed or keeping it open or a key open so that it can work properly. And usually there's a little kind of nub on a key that associates with that spring, and there's often a little hook. And so the spring will often kind of sit in that little hook in the nub there. And you have to check that, there's some sort of tension, like the spring is holding something back. If the spring is just sort of loose and not holding something in place, then you've probably got it on the wrong side of the little nub of the key. And it's a little hard to show because it's such a small thing, but you'll see as you're taking apart the keys, these little wire springs around the instrument, and you just kind of got to pay attention to which way they go, because that is the most common issue that I have found is when you put the bassoon back together, you put the spring in the wrong place, and so a pad isn't staying closed or a key isn't staying lifted up the way that it's supposed to, because the spring's not in the right place. That's the first point of error that you go to when you put the bassoon back together. On the boot joint of the bassoon, there's kind of an added issue where there are rods going through the center. Usually they're little black plastic rods that go through the center of the boot joint, and they kind of operate keys in tandem with each other. And so those are probably the most I'd say kind of difficult part to work with, because you want to make sure that you do not take those rods out of the boot joint. If they fall out, they're all certain lengths, and they all have a certain orientation that they go in. On my bassoon, there's 4 plastic rods. Sometimes there's only 3 depending on the bassoon. But after you've taken the keys off, if you pick the boot joint up and then you turn it over, you run the risk of those rods coming out, and then you can't tell where they came from. So that's one of those things that, like, if you're not comfortable, just don't do it, because that has happened to me before. I accidentally knocked out the rods on my boot joint, and I was stressed because I didn't know where they went, and I had to go into Bruce and say, hey, I need some help because I messed up. So just be super careful. So when I'm doing the boot joint, I only do one side of the boot joint, take everything off, grease everything, put it back together, and then I flip it over and do the other side of the boot joint. And that way there's kind of less keys to work with at a certain time, and then you lower the risk of those rods coming out. Then you don't have to like tilt the boot joint over. So every other joint, I take all the keys off at once. On the boot joint, I go, I do the front of the boot joint and then do the back of the boot joint separately. So that can be a very pro tip if you are having to work on your boot joint, taking it apart. And once you have taken all of the keys off and greased everything on all of the joints of the bassoon, you're basically finished. You've cleaned off all the dust and everything, and it's put back together. Then comes the time where you tell if you put everything back, because then you go to try to play the bassoon, and if it plays correctly, if all the keys feel like they're moving correctly, and you're not having any like weird notes or things that aren't speaking, that means you put everything back in the right place, and you put all the springs in the right side of the key, and you didn't forget any screws or whatnot. And a lot of times I forget something. I put a spring in a wrong place. I didn't tighten a screw all the way. Just really little simple things. It's kind of amazing, one tiny little adjustment on a key, whatever it may be, can really throw a lot of things out of whack, and it can make things feel really bad when you're playing. And so that's another reason why I don't recommend that you use this video as your only resource for taking apart your bassoon, because it can be just the slightest mistake can cause a lot of issues. So if that happens to you, which it probably will, especially if you've never done this before, just be patient, be calm, and try to work through the instrument, like play through it and figure out what notes exactly are you having trouble on. And if it's a specific note that's not sounding right, figure out what keys specifically are associated with that note, and figure out, is there a spring that's on the wrong side of the key? Did I not screw something in particularly well? Did I forget to put something back on? Just kind of work slowly and be really methodical as you go through and try to figure out what's going on. That can be a really good process. I mean, anytime there's anything wrong with your bassoon, that's the process you want to take, is figure out what note it is, what keys are associated with that note, what does it appear like they're supposed to be doing? Are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? And honestly, sometimes you can't figure it out and you need an expert. And that's where having a bassoon technician who knows what they're doing nearby is a huge benefit, and going to them to help you out. So just, you can probably see by now why I don't recommend doing this without some sort of support. So I'm going to keep playing out the rest of the video so that you can see the full process. I obviously skipped over some things. You'll notice, I didn't show every single last little key that could be taken off and put back on, because this video is already super long enough, and I tried to kind of just give you a basic overview of each joint, what it looks like. And this was an hours-long process. Took several days, actually, because I ended up not having time to finish one of my joints, and so I came back a second day and did it. So I hope this was helpful for you, especially if you're ever in a position where you maybe need to take off a couple keys off your bassoon for some reason. Like, this shows you the process for how to do it. Again, it's not rocket science. It's really not anything crazy. It just means that you have to be patient, and you have to be careful, and you have to be very diligent, especially about the order of keys that you take off and then subsequently put back on, and just pay attention to what you're doing. If this video was helpful for you, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe. I would love to hear from you, what you think down in the comments. Have you ever attempted to take any keys off of your bassoon? Do you feel like if you could do that after you're watching this video? What are your thoughts on this process?